So I'm talking about refugees and parks. When I talk about refugees, I'm talking about asylum seekers and refugees. And I'm going to start with refugees rather than parks. So what do we know about refugees? Refugees are people. They're accountants, artists, nurses, builders. They're introverts and extroverts. They're mums, dads, children. They're people who are really into their sport. And they're people who really prefer to watch television. And I suppose what's useful to think here is that these people have gone through generally incredible and devastating experiences that hopefully many of us, most of us will never have to face in terms of grief and loss and uncertainty. And I've put up some of those there. And the reason why I've chosen those particular ones there are about pulling out what that means in terms of their personal history, but also to highlight the lack of kind of personal agency. What you get as a refugee is a very, very reactive situation. And I've tried to kind of look at these in a kind of fairly broad thematic way. And the reason why I've chosen these themes is because I think these can start to link to public and use of public space, experiences of public space. So people who have significant health challenges, particularly in terms of mental health, people who might well be quite disorientated, especially in those first stages of arrival, often very lonely, very, very low social connections, various barriers to participating in everyday activities, could be language, almost certainly cost, where people live, uncertainty about how long they're going to be in any one place. And also vulnerable for a range of different reasons. And that vulnerability, I would say, often increased when they step outside into the public realm. So, given this situation, how does this relate to landscape? Among all these challenges, why is the ability to access and enjoy parks or urban public space in general important? Why do landscape architects have something to address in this situation for these people? I think one of the things that's often talked about in refugee studies is, and it's connected to this sense of lack of personal agency, it's really important not to just see refugees as victims. And I think then if you can see kind of other aspects of their experiences, I think this can also give us a bit of a clue about relevance for public space, because these sort of themes that I've put on this side may apply to all of us at different times in our life, maybe most of our lives. So people who actually seek respite or calm, or at least distraction in what can be very boring lives or circumstances, needing and able, have a history of adaptation, huge adaptation, looking for and needing to find new social connections, certainly have skills and experience to offer at all sorts of scales. And then the bottom one, I think, is really crucial, is that there's almost certainly some support needed. The challenges are pretty big, and therefore what kind of support might be needed? What is the kind of infrastructure that might help these become something that is possible to achieve? So it's a bit peculiar, but I'm going to move on to benches here. And that's just because 2 years ago, I did a year-long research project. It was a collaboration between myself and the Young Foundation and some other partners, local partners, on the role of benches and why benches are important in public life. And this project actually follows on directly in terms of funding from that project. Why? Because our primary finding from the bench project was really that spending time in public open spaces can support well-being and inclusion for many, but especially those commonly marginalised from other facilities. So people who haven't got busy jobs, who haven't got a very hectic social life, who aren't in education. And so when we thought about that key finding, we think, well, what do we do next? What's the next step for this work? We thought who kind of might be the most relevant group to look at here, and that's where the kind of idea of refugees as a kind of focus came from. And these were our sort of sub-finding. This was our manifesto for the good bench. This idea of how sitting on benches can support healthy outdoor routines. All these things are important, and obviously there's quite a strong connection between public open space in general, parks, space of leisure. It's not really ever just about the bench. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but there's a huge established quantity of literature about how contact with nature, time spent outdoors, can be good for your health and your well-being and in general. And I think there's always more to find out about what that means for particular people in particular circumstances or living in particular areas. But I think it's sort of foolish to write off this thing and say this isn't relevant. The refugee issue is, circumstances for refugees are so difficult that we can't think about nature connectedness and how that might be something that builds a positive step. So, but this is one of the kind of models of green care. So you may well be familiar with aspects of social prescribing and green prescribing, various vitamin nature, various kind of projects that are going on. And this is one of the models for that. And it's a very simple model, which I quite like. So meaningful activity, social contact, natural surroundings. But I think it is important to think about what does meaningful activity mean if you are in a situation living as a refugee or an asylum seeker in a country that's hugely familiar, unfamiliar, and with all that kind of factors that we looked at in the first slide. What does social contact mean when you've just arrived in a city, when you've been basically shipped to a particular part of the UK where you don't know people? And what does natural mean when you've grown up in a home, in an ecological context, in a cultural landscape that is incredibly different from UK weather, landscape typologies, patterns of recreation? So I think it's kind of, you need to be critical about these. You need to kind of start to think about what these different aspects might mean and what might green care mean for different people. It's not a simple kind of sticking plaster. And then moving on to the theme more of inclusion, I think again, I'm preaching to converted, but what is special about urban public space as a connecting location? And one of the places that we made the film about in the Bench project was this site in place at Gordon Square in Woolwich, an amazing place where people spent time, hung out, and where the visibility of difference was really valued on a very basic level. Places of leisure can give a sense of communality through mutual choice. Participation can be straightforward and hopefully comfortable if the places are robust and clean enough so it's easy to be tolerant of difference and where there is a basic level of safety. That allow people to find out different ways of fitting, whether it's doing something that you're good at or something that's new to you, whether it's maintaining old friendships or finding new ones, whether it's making your mark, being part of the ongoing change in a city. And being outside is often an experientially rich experience. Many of our memories, even short-term memories, come from being outside. And that's a great way in to develop a sense of local belonging, even over quite short periods of time. So our project is actually very practical focused. So this money is entirely about how we make changes in practice, how managers of urban green space can better support refugee visitors, but also how refugee support organisations can utilise access to urban green space as a resource. We're working in Sheffield, in London and in Berlin to try and learn as much as we can from those different places. And we're also working with national organisations such as the Wildlife Trust, such as Mind, such as Cities of Sanctuary movement. So we're trying to understand refugee experience at parks. We're interviewing and spending time with refugees, but we're also doing a lot of interviews with stakeholders, with people from green space sector organisations, friends of groups, council workers, a range of different things, community cohesion and well-being. So we're doing about 25 different stakeholder interviews across a kind of range of different organisations from these different sides. And we're creating a resource of good practice case studies from across Northern Europe. So this is the tricky bit because we're kind of halfway through this. So this is the first time I've even dared to say what we're starting to find out. But it's only, it's a short project, so it's only a few months, and I'll be able to say it a bit more confidently. Oh, I knew there'd be one slide where the formatting went skewy. But so anxiety and lack of... So what have we learnt so far about refugee experiences of public open space? Anxiety and lack of confidence is a real big one. And so a lot of time, especially if you are an asylum seeker and you're going through this and you can't work, is spent indoors and often in quite unsatisfactory housing conditions. There's a lack of understanding about what to do in a park, and even refugees with children, not all obviously, but some stories of people just not thinking that parks would be a place to take children. Very culturally different situation. Parks are often seen as too quiet, maybe too empty. And there's the weather, which is the difficultest to fix, I think. Fear of crime, but microclimate, we can still do things. Fear of crime shapes perception. So this idea that parks are white places is a story that we've heard, and often very, very different depending on whether you're a man or a woman. But there are really good little stories as well, and I'm hoping we're going to have lots of narratives, the stories and little scenarios where actually it does work, and if you go in a large group and you find a place where you can have fun and you can hang out and you get pleasure from that. So what does refugees welcome in parks look like? Well, I think there's kind of two sides of things. One is you're outside and you're doing something, and that's on this speaking outside doing could be anything from having a picnic to taking part in organised sport or gardening project. It's something, you're doing something, and to a certain extent the fact it's outside is not inconsequential, but it's the doing that's the important thing.
2 minutes.
And the other thing is the kind of more broadly access all areas. Where can you go through the city and know what you want to find? How do you explore? This side, more about parks. This side, more about the city as a whole. Down the bottom, and this isn't a kind of even thing, but down the bottom, more about low facilitation once you've set something up. Further up, probably needs ongoing facilitation, probably higher management costs, or a bit more kind of work put into facilitating. And that's true of any a running group, whether it's a refugee running group or not refugee running group. This is true. So, some things require facilitation. But I think it's really good to be honest about what the implications of doing these things are. What can we learn from refugees and refugee support organisations about improving experience of green space for refugees? So at the end of every interview, we say, what advice would you give? If it's a refugee sector support, we say, what advice would you give to green space sector? Collaborate with other groups, busier usually better, safety a priority, communication, come with a friend. How we communicate about our parks is really important. It's actually quite hard to find good visual information. Support any connections with food. And I think therefore what we are talking about, if you start to look at what is working and then extend that, what we're talking about is social infrastructure. So I have a kind of tentative idea about how we can maximise the benefits. A lot of these things are kind of happening. There's probably some of these things happening in your city or in a city near you. But I wonder if some of the ones on this side also flagged up or help people gain confidence in exploring the city as a whole. And if you've somehow got a scheme that's about exploring the city as a whole, if it could then become a way where it's easier to find the particular thing that makes you feel you, then that could really maximise the benefits of what's happening already, and of course to do more of it. So what we're doing is we're running until November, though I'm sure I personally will just be working on this for a long time, is that we want to learn from good practice, and we can all do that. We're doing that as a project, but also I think you can do that now. There will be things happening local to you. So my advice would be to anyone who sort of thinks this could be something that you could get involved with as a landscape architect, is find out what's going on in your area and possibly make a connection. Red Cross, Refugee Council, all will be working in every city to do this. And they are keen. What we've really found is that there will be people in those organisations who get this, who get it. And then if you can, and there's also lots of local charities and individual groups for each city. If you are involved in any form of community participation, of programming, especially if you're in a local government or local authority context, I think you are in a perfect position. Then think about what those connections could do. Is there any way in which you could collaborate? And I think that, you know, as a profession, we are in a really excellent position because we join the social, the health, and the space. We are in a real position to make a difference in terms of well-being and inclusion for refugees. And if any of this strikes a chord, or if any of this is something that even in the next year or two you do something about and maybe something good happens, then please let me know. I would really love to hear. So get back in contact. Thank you.